Hello there, my dear internet friends. I am not an expert, I'm just a nerd, but I'm here to be a nerd with you as we dive into the wonderful world of our history. So let's get started. The year is 1300 BC, and we are in ancient Assyria, in the great capital city of Assur. And we are visiting the home of a soldier and his wife. And theirs is a happy marriage normally. And to be honest, to be a citizen of the city of Assur at this time would have been to be a person on the up and up. For generations before this, the Assyrian city-state had been subject to and attacked by various different other nations, their biggest enemies being the Hittites and the Mitanni mostly. Though finally, by our soldiers' time, a new king, Adad-nirari, had defeated them, and for the first time in maybe forever, it would have felt like a new day was dawning, something better. The future would have looked bright. And when we meet our soldier, he has just come back from the north, fighting off the remnants of the Hittites. But I'm unfortunately not here to tell you about an ancient soldier's happy homecoming. I'm not even really here to tell you about the history of ancient Assyria. No, I'm here to tell you a ghost story. An ancient Mesopotamian ghost story. But before I do, I have two things I have to give you, a warning and a promise. The warning is that since there's been so much time, literally over 3,000 years between me and that soldier, I'm piecing together a lot of info here. So in a way, in a very real way, you could say that the ghost story I'm about to tell you is completely made up. But here's the second thing I have to give you, and it's that promise. And that promise is this. Even bearing in mind the challenges I just admitted to you of time and loss of evidence and everything else, this ghost story is 100% true and accurate and did, in some way, word for word happen. And I am 100% confident by the end of this episode that you will agree with me that you've heard a story of actual ghosts being defeated in the ancient world. But a promise doesn't mean much coming from someone that you don't know. And so now it's up to me to keep that promise. And so let's dive in. Our brave soldier, upon returning home from his most recent campaign in the king's army, fighting the remnants of the Hittites to the north, seemed at first to his friends and wife to be the same happy, hard-working man as always. He had been delighted to see his wife and everyone again. And though he mentioned losing a dear friend in this most recent fighting, other than brief moments of sadness as he got settled into home again to start the planting season, all seemed well. However, soon little changes started to become apparent. His mood changed. Soon he became irritable, withdrawn from his family, who noticed he seemed to be struggling to sleep. And when he did, his wife was often horrified by the harrowing screams that would emerge from him in his slumber. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. He seemed to see things, react to people who weren't there, and admitted to his wife in a moment of desperation the truth of it all, that he was being attacked by ghosts of the battlefield dead. His wife, terrified for her husband, bought amulets to put in his clothes and above where they slept to try to protect him. And she prayed fervently at the temples to protect her husband, but day by day, the ghosts only seemed to plague him worse. He saw them often now in waking hours, and they tormented him terribly. He would sometimes indeed even be visibly struck by them so strongly they clearly, in front of her eyes, prevented him from speaking clearly. His body racked with terror and sweat and horror as he stared up at his wife, gripped by these horrible ghosts from his past. Desperate, she knew she needed help. After consulting at one of the temples, two men, one specializing in the herbal arts and one an exorcist, had been advised and sent to the haunted couple's home to attempt to quell the vicious spirits afflicting them. And the herbalist and the exorcist, after arriving, would examine our soldier carefully, dutifully taking notes from him and his wife of all the symptoms that had afflicted him. They would listen as our ancient veteran described symptoms of flashbacks and night terrors and difficulty sleeping, mood changes, and feeling withdrawn. Our ancient veteran would have told all these symptoms to them. And this would have only confirmed the issue to these two holy men. The soldier was the subject of spiritual attack. His dead enemies from the battlefield were clearly seeking vengeance against him. And here, I admit, I can't help but wonder if he'd been alive today, if our soldier had been alive today, if maybe that diagnosis would have gone a little bit differently. And listen, I want to make it clear, I'm not a medical professional at all. And even if I were, there's a little over 3,000 years separating me and this soldier. And this info actually is taken from the United States Veterans Affairs website. It's really helpful. They have a whole page on symptoms and different types of treatment. They even have a page for family members. But anyway, our professionals in ancient Mesopotamia didn't have web page technology, obviously, or any modern technology. And they now had, as I said, finished their own investigation. This was important because they were professionals. And now that they had the specifics, they could proceed, though they would have to wait till the latest part of the night to go forward with the ritual. Such a powerful ghostly possession would require an equally powerful exorcism, one that could only be started in the thick black darkness right before dawn. They would have prepared the house and the afflicted carefully in the hours of the night leading up to that moment. The room and the soldier must be clean and tidy. The herbalist by now would be combining necessary ingredients to provide medicine to soothe and calm the afflicted during the exorcism. And perhaps it would have been the herbalist too who had made at an earlier date the incense that would now be lit. Its fragrant, beautiful smoke would have filled the little rooms of the dark house as the night wore on. A holy aroma designed to drive away negative forces and spirits, similar to the smoke that wafted from the temples. Sacred carvings would have been given to our soldier to give him spiritual protection and power as the ritual neared, maybe bearing the image of Pazuzu or dogs. And his wife may well have been present too, as the exorcism was about to begin, to comfort her struggling husband through the supernatural ordeal that was about to come. The exorcist, after careful study and prayer and reflection, would have begun his chants in the darkness. First, he would have demanded the ghost's attention, calling upon the divine power of the gods of the great Assyrian pantheon to ensure the spirits plaguing our soldier would have to obey. With the smoke rising still and the oil lamps flickering, the exorcist, not knowing the name of the ghost or ghosts afflicting our friend, would have then spit forth a list, an exhaustive, holy, ritualistic list of all known types of evil spirits that could come back to wreak havoc upon the living, leaving no awful attribute unsaid, since ghosts can look like different things to different people after all, which the following selection demonstrates. You who are the Bennu, the watcher of the night. You who constantly picks on victims like a Lilu demon. You who constantly stands at the head of the afflicted. And as the list of spirits progressed, we can imagine our tormented soldier may have seen his battlefield ghosts again, may have been forced to be exposed to them again, but at least now with protection, and this time not alone. You who are the watcher at noon. You who constantly terrify the afflicted. You who constantly slithers like a snake near the afflicted. The list would have seemed almost endless, as every spirit who could taunt the soldier, every psychic grip they had on his soul would be named and brought forth and dealt with. You who have been killed in battle. You who constantly obscures like a black spot. You who have perished in destruction. And then, only after every single type of ghost had been listed, every evil spirit declared, the exorcist would have demanded forcibly, by the gods, for the cursed ghost to leave this place, to leave this man and to never return, or face the wrath of the great god Shamash, who now, as the sun was beginning to rise and was starting to peek through the darkness, would have been lending his holy rays and light to this endeavor, because evil cannot win. And the spirits may not linger here. And then it would have been over. And then that would have been the end. And oof, very classic sort of ghost story. Or really not ghosts. It sounds like the exorcist in ancient Assyria. You even got two priests, you see that? The whole thing with its incense and incantations and amulets, it's all very mystical. And if one is of a certain mindset, you could even think barbaric. It can be hard even to imagine this ritual I just described happening in like a day-to-day context for someone. And we need to step back and look at the ancient world as a whole. And when we do, we'll see that these rituals and these ideas about ghosts are not specific to ancient Mesopotamia. See, ghost hunting in the ancient world was a very real and very serious business. We're going to look at the ways different cultures around the world have interacted with their dead. We're going to learn more about how our ancient soldier would have been raised to view the spirits of the deceased in his own lifetime. And after all that, we're going to come back to our exorcism, our late night / early morning exorcism, our oh so dramatic ritual, and see if we can't see it with less mysticism and more clarity. Because it's time to learn about how they handled their hauntings in the ancient world. And it's time to meet the ghost hunters of ancient Assyria. Hello, my name is Marie, and welcome to Lost Realms. Each episode we look at a different city, place, or people who have been lost to us, whether through the destruction of a disaster, the ravages of climatic changes, the failure of governments, or the cruelty of neighbors. Each one of these wonderful places and people were taken from us forever. Some were wonderful and were part of the very best and brightest of humanity. Some could be considered part of the origin story of monsters. But all of these places and people remain part of our shared collective human history, and all of them we attempt with love and understanding to get to know here. Ghosts are fascinating, and ghosts can be terrifying. Do I believe in ghosts? I'm not sure. But one thing that I know for sure is that basically everyone in the ancient world did. The ancient world was crazy for ghosts. Ghost stories are everywhere you look. Some are so eerily familiar to the ones we have today that it'll give you chills, and some are just kind of really far out there from a modern perspective, from an outsider's viewpoint. But everywhere we go in the ancient world where there's ghosts, there's also ghost hunters, there's exorcists, there's priests, and people working hard to fend off evil of the spiritual variety, but doing so from a completely different viewpoint and methodology than the ghost hunters you might see on TV today. It was a completely different way of thinking about the topic. Something that I think can get lost if we approach it with the topic of ghosts solely from like a modern perspective. Ghosts were a lot different to the people back then than they are to us today. But if we're truly going to understand any of that, understand any of what our soldier was going through with his exorcism, then we need to start with a bigger story. And that bigger story is the story of ghosts throughout human history. The supernatural world of our ancient ancestors was a beautiful and complex one. And I should say, by our ancient ancestors, I literally mean by Homo sapiens basically everywhere. As I mentioned in the introduction, the belief in ghosts in the ancient world was basically just the norm. You wouldn't go around asking someone if you believed in ghosts. They almost certainly did. It was more a matter of what they thought those ghosts looked or acted like, or how you dealt with them. We see evidence of this in the archaeological remains of all known ancient cultures. Ancient Egypt, for example, which is so famous for its mummification process and its very elaborate views of the afterlife, they believed in ghosts. However, since the deceased was supposed to go on to this very definite afterlife, if a ghost was to appear in your home, that would be a sign that something's very, very wrong. A ghost could be the result of improper burial rites or some sin that the living had committed against the ghost's memory. We found written remains from temples, for example, of family members seeking help when they believed that a deceased relative's ghost was plaguing them and causing them to become sick. And in sort of an ancient play on the modern build a house on an Indian burial ground trope, there's stories from ancient Egypt of people acquiring homes or property only to find out after the fact that that property was on top of someone's remains or something of that nature, and a ghost appearing to force them to right this wrong. And it's, again, very classic. And if we move around a little bit and go to ancient China, we see the same sort of thing. Ghosts, on one hand, could be reasoned with and offered gifts and other things, and a deceased relative that you kept happy could offer warnings and wisdom to living family members. However, again, if you were to just see a ghost in your home show up all of a sudden, that's probably a really bad sign. Negatively inclined ghosts could cause mischief, disease, illness, even death. And negative ghosts in ancient China seem to exist for a similar reason as they did in ancient Egypt. This could be the result again of improper burial rites or some sin that the living had committed. There's even stories too of water spirits, of people who drowned in a particular body of water and now were forced to haunt that body of water and would lure people in to try to drown there too. Or also of hungry ghosts, spirits of people who have been greedy in life and now in death were these hungry, perpetually starved things destined to roam the earth. And in fact, if we widen our gaze still and look at the entire ancient world, it's not just that belief in ghosts were common, but we see lots of other common themes too. A ghost is not necessarily a good thing if it shows up, for example, and it's usually the result of some sort of impropriety or sin, or perhaps a less than noble death. And across the board as well, we also see people rising to meet these challenges and dangers. In every culture I mentioned, and in every culture with ghosts in it, there's always the ghost hunter. There's always the priest, the priestess, the shaman, the medicine man, the person there that knows the prayers or tries to know the prayers to protect the living from the wrathful dead. And well, in each culture that may look differently. The prayers may be said to different deities. The magical amulets presented may be made of different stone, but the intent is always similar. And before we go any further in our story, I think that's a viewpoint that I really have to make clear. That if you approach someone and said, hey, I'm being haunted in the ancient world, in our ancient Mesopotamian area of Assur specifically, you would not have faced skepticism. And when the wife of our soldier in Assur, in ancient Assyria in 1300 BC, ran to the temple and told them, hey, my husband's being haunted. He's being attacked by ghosts. She would not have feared that they wouldn't believe her or be worried that they would not take this problem seriously. The ghosts that her husband was seeing and the pain that he was going through would have been viewed as a very valid and real and troubling problem, one worthy of help and attention. There would have been no question as to if she was overreacting. There would have been no question as to if, well, maybe your husband's just not strong enough. He didn't handle the battlefield well enough this time. Maybe he's just crazy. None of this would have been an issue in the ancient Assyrian world. This man is in pain. This man is seeing ghosts. And well, I know ghosts mean different things to them back then than they do today. The seriousness with which they treated our soldier and the pain that he was going through is something that I think we can admire and hope to emulate today. And now I think it's time for us to narrow our focus again back into the city of Assur, to the home of our soldier, and explore just what his life would have been like up until this point. The daily life of a citizen in the great city of Assur, including our soldier, would have been a very structured one. And indeed, the hierarchy of power in ancient Assyrian society was very structured, starting with the king at the top, obviously, who could be thought of as a representation of the divine. Spreading out beneath him would have been his officials and aristocrats, some of which would have been born to the role. However, some could earn that status through merit. And as we'll see, Assyrian society was kind of a complex mixture of surprisingly progressive thought and extremely strict discipline and law. Beneath the nobility in general were what we would call the free citizens. These were your craftsmen, your merchants, your landowners, your military officers. And they would have enjoyed certain rights and legal protections in their society. And Assyria, following the example of the earlier Sumerian society before it, had an extremely detailed code of law, the remnants of which by our soldiers' day in 1300 BC would have already been ancient. Continuing on our social strata, underneath the free citizens would have been the commoners. This would have been primarily composed of farmers and laborers, and they would have had far fewer rights and privileges than the so-called free citizen. And beneath all of these others were the slaves, who enjoyed no rights whatsoever. And the average day-to-day life of a person living in ancient Assur would have been filled with a tapestry of these different types of people. Ancient Assyrian society was a complex one. While patriarchal, women enjoyed certain rights and privileges like owning property in ancient Assyria that they wouldn't have necessarily in other places like ancient Greece, for example. And that detailed law code I mentioned, well, having some punishments that today would be considered extremely draconian, was also a very detailed and clearly well thought out legal code that covered everything from criminal law to civil law, including property rights, family law, trade regulations, and civil contracts. Ancient Assyria would leave behind some of the most beautiful artistic arts produced anywhere in the ancient world. However, they would also leave behind a reputation of being one of the most hated and brutal empires in human history. And if you look at this map that I'm showing you on screen here now, it's easy to see how neighborly tensions could start to begin. For the longest time, Assyria had been this tiny little chunk of land surrounded on all sides by enemies. To establish and maintain any kind of independence, Assyria would have to fight for her place on this Mesopotamian battlefield and would have to keep herself and her soldiers at a constant state of military readiness. I mentioned to you at the start of this episode of the king of our soldiers' time, Adad-nirari, when I told you of how he had recently defeated the enemies of the Hittites and the Mitanni. Well, those victories were a long time coming. And all of this fighting to stay on top or even just to hold one's own meant that the Assyrian military had to become extremely disciplined. They had to become very organized. And by the time of our soldiers' day, the Assyrian military had become a well-oiled war machine. And this is an area where they would only improve still over time. And the conquests of the Assyrian kings would become so legendary and so horrific that the phrase, quote, "I destroyed, devastated, and burned with fire," end quote, became commonly used in royal inscriptions. And all healthy, able men were required to take part in this war machine. Our soldier, our ghost-ridden soldier, would never have had a choice in the matter. Even the ancient Assyrian way of life would have been carefully regimented around this practice. There was a season for planting, a season for building, and a season for war. And when the season for war came, there was no denying it. There was no walking away. Whether you wanted to go halfway across the known world and be part of a brutal conquest or not, that was what time it was. When your king is an embodiment of the divine on earth, you don't really get to say no when he says it's time to bear arms. And I'm sure there were some men who did enjoy their service, even if it was a very different type than the soldiers of today would be forced to endure. And not all of ancient Assyrian society was war and gloom and doom. As I said, they had a rich artistic culture, and as you've seen now several times, a hearty spiritual life. There are many different temples to many different deities found in the city of Assur. Almost certainly the most prominent would have been to the god Assur himself, the city's own chief deity and mascot, if you like, as was very common in the ancient world. Many cities had their own patron god or goddess. But many of the far more ancient deities from the earlier ancient Sumerian pantheon would have been carried down into Assyrian culture. You heard the name Shamash mentioned in the exorcism at the start, the ancient god of sunlight and divine justice. Ishtar would have been also known to them, the ancient lady of love and war. And of course, just like ancient China and Egypt, along with the deities, there were also many spirits in the picture. Just like everywhere else, the ancient Mesopotamians and our ancient soldier friend in Assyria would have believed that the dead could come back to haunt the living, but only under specific circumstances. Our Assyrian soldier would have believed in an underworld that could be known by many names, but perhaps the most common was Urkala, literally the land of no return. This was a dark, dank, wet, cold place where the spirits relied on gifts from the living to sustain them, and there they would be ruled by the queen of the dead, Ereshkigal. Normally, the gods would not allow any spirits to escape this dark realm. However, once in a while, a ghost could find a way out and come and wreak havoc upon the living. Or sometimes, if a spirit had been wronged in some way, as we've heard in other cultures, the Assyrians believed too that this spirit could be given permission to come back and allowed to torment the living as a type of spiritual justice. However, as long as you did no wrong, you could always call upon Shamash or other deities such as Pazuzu to help save you from these evil spirits. But banishing ghosts would not have been a priest's only thought in ancient Assyria. To be a priest working at a temple in the city of Assur would have meant saying prayers for people and tending to the needs of the deity. It could also mean exorcisms the way that we saw at the beginning of the episode. But also, as you heard me say then, there were different types of priests. I referred to a herbalist and an exorcist, modern English terms for ancient Assyrian job titles. The herbalist would be more properly called an assur, someone who combined herbs together to make medicines. The Assyrians did note that Illnesses could come from not ghosts, from eating bad food or from an injury, but the spiritual and the physical were kind of tied together as one. There's no reason to think a physical and a spiritual ailment couldn't be caused by the same thing. And an assu, one that made these medicines, would often work in tandem with what they would call an asipu, so that exorcist role. And these two, as well as other types of priests and ritualists in ancient Assyrian society, would have provided a full spectrum of medical and emotional and spiritual care to the people coming to their temples. The ancient Assyrians built their society on top of the legacy of the ancient Sumerians, which had already been a literate and highly advanced society for thousands of years before Assur came to prominence. We have records showing us what it took to become an Assyrian doctor, basically a priest that worked in these temples and was in charge of the medical well-being of their worshippers. A priest and a doctor were basically the same thing. But not just anybody could become one. It took years of intensive study of copying earlier medical texts, both for the assu, the herbalist, and for the asipu, the exorcist. These historical sources also show us that these medical professionals at the start of their career in the temples would receive very structured training where they would be supervised and only allowed to work with certain types of patients until they were experienced enough to handle the more difficult cases. Whole medical textbooks and encyclopedias in cuneiform have been recovered, and I'll put some links up in today's sources so you can see for yourself, but look at some of these. It's fascinating. This was a highly medically advanced ancient society in the year 1300 BC, to the point that we even know what their diagnostic process looked like, and they took it very, very seriously. They would meet with the patient and sit with them and assess what their symptoms were. And while they might come to a different answer than we would today, like I said, ghost was very, very common. A very, very common answer was ghost. But the herbalist that made the medicine to keep the haunted person calm and help them sleep, that herbalist would have been working off thousands, literally thousands of years of advanced knowledge to know what to make to get them the rest they needed. The exorcist would have been literally working off thousands of years of notes and prayers from previous priests for generations going back, showing them through trial and error what prayers and incantations made the wounded person feel better, what prayers and incantations brought the wounded a sense of peace, what made the wounded's ghosts go away. And I keep using that phrase wounded for a reason. In some of these ancient cuneiform notes and encyclopedias we found, these doctor priests refer to physical wounds like someone breaking a leg or getting stabbed or whatever. They also refer to something else, something they literally refer to when translated into English as mental wounds. Specifically, they sometimes talk about mental wounds from men coming back from the wars. Men who, if their symptoms are translated into English, sound quite familiar. Flashbacks, night terrors, difficulty sleeping, mood changes, self-isolation. These ancient Assyrian priest doctors note all these mental wounds very carefully. And honestly, I keep doing this and I keep dancing around it. And I guess, again, I think it's because I'm not a medical professional. I don't feel comfortable saying that this is that. It's not up to me. I can't say it. I can't say that this is that. Thankfully, I don't have to. In 2015, a team of researchers published an article in the Journal of Early Science and Medicine. This article was the result of a study of ancient Assyrian cuneiform tablets, looking at in particular some of those written by our good priest doctors. And after carefully poring over these ancient medical notes, they chose to name the article containing their findings, quote, "Nothing New Under the Sun, Post-Traumatic Stress Disorders in the Ancient World." In it, they would praise our exorcist and our herbalist and everyone like them for their advanced medical care, and the results of their study caused a phenomenon, and their info was featured on the Smithsonian website, the BBC, and helped change what we thought we knew about mental health treatment in the ancient world. Because even though ghosts can look like very different things to very different people, that doesn't mean we can't find ways to deal with them no matter who we are. And on that note, I think it's time for us to go back to our exorcism ritual and see if we can't use a few of the things that we've learned to solve the last few mysteries of our ghost story. The year is 1300 BC, and we are in the great capital city of Assur, in ancient Assyria, and we are here to visit the home of a soldier. But unfortunately, I'm not here to tell you about an old-timey soldier's homecoming, or even about the history of Assyria. No, we're here for a ghost story. And here it is. Our brave soldier, upon returning home from his most recent campaigns in the king's army fighting the remnants of the Hittites to the north, seemed at first to his family and friends the same happy, hard-working man he'd always been. He'd been delighted to see his wife and everyone again. And though he had mentioned losing a dear friend in this most recent fighting, other than brief moments of sadness as he settled into home again to start the planning season, all seemed well. However, soon little changes started to become apparent. His mood changed. He became irritable and withdrawn from family, who noticed he seemed to be struggling to sleep. When he did, his wife was often horrified from the harrowing screams that would emerge from him in his slumber. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. He seemed to see things, people who weren't there, and admitted to his wife in a moment of desperation the truth of it all, that he was being attacked by ghosts of the battlefield dead. His wife, terrified for her husband, bought amulets to put in his clothes and above where they slept to protect him, and she prayed fervently for her beloved, but day by day, the ghosts only seemed to plague him worse. He saw them often now in waking hours, and they tormented him terribly. He would sometimes indeed even be visibly struck by them so strongly that they clearly, in front of her eyes, prevented him from speaking. His body racked with terror and sweat and horror as he stared up at his wife, gripped by these horrible ghosts from his past. Desperate, she knew she needed help. After consulting at the temple, 2 men, one specializing in the herbal arts and one an exorcist, had been advised and sent to the haunted couple's home to attempt to quell the vicious spirits afflicting them. And the exorcist and the herbalist, with their servants after arriving, would examine our soldier carefully, dutifully taking note from him and his wife all of the ghostly attacks he had faced. They would listen as our ancient veteran described his symptoms of flashbacks and nightmares, difficulty falling asleep, mood changes. Our veteran would have shared all this to them. This would have only confirmed the issue to the 2 holy men. The soldier was the subject of spiritual attack. His dead enemies from the battlefield were clearly seeking vengeance against him. They finished their investigation, and this was important because they were professionals, the exorcist and the herbalist, and now that they had the specifics, they could proceed, though they would have to wait until the latest part of the night to go forward with the ritual. Such a powerful ghostly possession would require an equally powerful exorcism, one that could only be done in the thick black darkness right before dawn. They would have prepared the house and the afflicted carefully in the hours of the night leading up to that moment. The room and the soldier must be clean and tidy. The herbalist by now would be combining the necessary ingredients to provide medicine to soothe and calm the afflicted during the exorcism. And perhaps it would have been the herbalist too at an earlier date who had made the incense that would now be lit. Its fragrant, beautiful smoke would have filled the little rooms of the dark house as the night wore on. A holy aroma designed to drive away negative forces and spirits, similar to the incense that burned in the temples. Sacred carved images would have been given to our soldier to give him spiritual power and protection as the ritual neared, maybe bearing an image of Pazuzu or dogs. And his wife may well have been present too as the exorcism was about to begin, to comfort her struggling husband through the supernatural ordeal that was to come. The exorcist, after careful study and reflection and prayer, would have begun his chants in the darkness. First, he would have demanded the ghost's attention, calling upon the power of the gods of the great Assyrian pantheon to ensure the spirits plaguing our soldier would have to obey. With the smoke rising still and the oil lamps flickering, the exorcist, not knowing the name of the ghost or ghosts afflicting our soldier, would have spit forth this list, an exhaustive, ritualistic, holy list of all known types of evil spirit that could return to wreak havoc upon the living, leaving no awful attribute unsaid, since ghosts can look like different things to different people, as the following selection demonstrates. You who are the Bennu, the watcher of the night. You who constantly picks on victims like a Lilu demon. You who constantly stands at the head of the afflicted. And as the list of spirits progressed, we can imagine our tormented soldier may have seen his battlefield ghosts again, may have been forced to be exposed to them again, but at least now with protection, and this time not alone. You who are the watcher at noon. You who constantly terrify the afflicted. You who constantly slithers like a snake near the afflicted. The list would have seemed almost endless, as every spirit who could taunt the soldier, every psychic grip they had on his soul would be named and brought forth and dealt with. You who have been killed in battle. You who constantly obscures like a black spot. You who have perished in destruction. And only after every single known type of ghost had been listed, every evil spirit declared, would the exorcist have then forcibly demanded by the gods for the cursed ghost to leave this place and this man, and to never return, or face the wrath of the great god Shamash, who now, as the sun was beginning to rise and would have begun to peek through the darkness, would be lending his holy rays and power to this endeavor, because evil cannot win, and the spirits may not linger here. And then it would have been over. And that is the end. And, there's no online census results I have for the success rate of these ancient Mesopotamian exorcisms. But I have no reason to think it didn't work. And whether our soldier was facing literal ghosts of the supernatural variety or ghosts of another kind, then I think in the end, the result is still the same. Either way, I'm happy he got the help he needed. And can I just say, I don't think we give ourselves enough credit sometimes. Yes, I know we humans can be very, very awful, but every once in a while, when the stars align and the winds blow the right way, we can be pretty awesome too. I'm proud of us. Oh, there we go. And that means it's the end of the day here and the end of our story. And thank you so much for being here with me for the story of the ancient Assyrian ghost hunters. I loved making it, and I hope you loved watching it. We might have to do a couple more creepier type of videos on my channel, so I still don't know if I believe in ghosts. But if you have any ghost stories you'd like to share, or you'd just like to reach out, please feel free to drop down in the comments below. I'd also love to hear any suggestions you have for an upcoming episode. Also be sure to keep a lookout for Ancient Assyrian Ghost Hunters Lost Bits episode. Lost Bits is a companion series I run on my channel along with these main episodes. In each edition of Lost Bits, I break down interesting bits of information I find while making these main episodes. It's also a place for me to answer your questions and just get to know you guys better. The Lost Bits are usually available a few days after these main episodes, so when it's ready, I'll put a link right up here. And if that sounds like your thing, be sure to check it out. Speaking of research and information, the source list for today's episode is, as always, pinned to the top comment below. So please don't stop there. Never let my words be the only words you hear on any topic. Your local library might have a book on ancient Assyria too. I also have a bunch more of mysterious history from our past over on my channels, and I do multiple uploads a week, so if you like today's story, subscribe so you don't miss anything. But either way, thank you again so much for being here. It's not just for your viewership, but for your curiosity, your empathy, and your humanity. Because if you have an interest in our human history, that means that you do have all these qualities, and I'm very proud of you for having them. And have a wonderful rest of your day. Go with all my love. Goodbye.